Okay, in this presentation, I want to kind of wrap up this semester's work, and one thing that I was thinking about this semester while I was working with students in the American legal system class, which teaches students how to think and conduct research like a lawyer. And a lot of folks, they think of the location of the courts, and I guess they forget that the location of the courts is for lawyers, and then judges are people who studied law, who were lawyers and then became judges. So it's all about this kind of game of law. And in one kind of classic study, that the further you kind of go in this world, the more you'll know about is this study called Why the Haves Come Out Ahead. In other words, why powerful people tend to maintain their power over other people. And it's not too surprising, but it's basically that powerful people know their rights and they know how to use the law to kind of defend themselves in a bunch of different situations. And so my kind of whole point that I've been struggling with many of you, although a lot of you have actually made quite a bit of progress, is this idea: if you see law as just simply commandments, then you're going to be on the losing end of the law, and mostly both in criminal and civil law. And many of you are just kind of started getting the understanding that there's something called civil law, which is actually the majority of law. And so getting away from this idea of looking at just cops and that kind of law will help you tremendously, both in your personal life as a citizen, whether you see yourself as a global citizen or a United States citizen, and then also as you kind of go through your academic career, that will then kind of lead to how you do economically. So I wanted to put my money where my mouth was, and today I'll give you a personal example of someone who knows how to use their rights and how I would do it, and then we'll talk about whether that's the right thing to do. And that's a bit of a pun, but it's also the actual basis of our concept of rights. Is it the moral thing to do? Is it the appropriate thing to do? And that's a 2,000-year-old or older concept of what the law is. It's a moral kind of statement or a spirit, as Montesquieu called it. Hegel is a German philosopher that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. cited to on multiple occasions. And this is all kind of the same ideas, that the law, when it is right, is the absolute ideal. However, human beings make so many mistakes that it would be silly for us to think that we are living in the right. So in this presentation, I really want to talk about this kind of spirit of the law, how we could provide more equitable opportunities for people, especially who do not have the same power. And then something that I think comes up a lot with educators. And so in some ways, this is also for educators who are thinking about this kind of very frustrating experience in the classroom of something called student resistance. And I'm getting this phrase from a woman named Beverly Tatum, who is a critical race scholar and who has taught in a variety of different contexts. So I have to ask this kind of obvious question at the beginning, because it comes up so much. I've been talking to a lot of professors this semester about how to teach online and whether you can recreate the physical classroom online, which is, of course, you cannot, right? Having online friends or having Facebook friends is not the same thing as having a friend who's in your house and you're having a good time. Having an online party is not the same thing as having a party in physical reality. So I wanted to kind of get people to think about this, but this question kept coming up, and it's amazing that this question comes up, right, from professors, which is, is college even for thinking? Do students want to think? And one of the books that we've been reading is Critical Thinking by Bell Hooks, and she says, most students have not been trained to think. So when they come to college, it's the last thing they want to do because it's hard. And I guess there's a certain number of students who come to college and think it's going to be easy. And it's an interesting kind of phenomenon. I've talked to a lot of students this semester who have told me, in conversation, that they're enjoying these conversations we're having because in some of their classrooms, they're not encouraged to think. On the other hand, as I'll kind of go through in this presentation, some students get very angry if I ask them to think. Or try to learn something new. And so, we want to think about this idea as like equity, right? If we're trying to provide an equitable structure, a new social relations where power can be shared, that means the burden and the responsibility has to be shared as well. And again, most of you understand this and you put in extra amount of work, but I do want you to be aware of folks who don't see the rule of law the same way as you do, because you'll kind of come into this more and more. And then we'll talk kind of concretely about the power of the professor. And, if you thought about law as a command, then that means I can do whatever I want. And certainly that can't be true. And so there must be limits to my power, and we want to think about how law mediates that. Now, again, if we look at Bloom's taxonomy, which is used, universally throughout classes, especially when it comes time to grade, in most of your classes, and in Intro to Criminal Justice, this is perfectly fine, although I happen to know from talking to Dr. Chapman that he pushes you further than just remembering, the bottom level of thinking. But in most classes, you'll do remembering, right? You'll read something, you'll remember it, and you'll put the correct answer, C, on your multiple choice exam. And then you'll get 10 points, and you add up your points, and you've got, your grade, which, if I look at the averages of criminal justice students or Justice Academy students, depending on what you believe, it's a C average. And so most of you are getting 70 out of 100, across your multiple choice, which means that you're average at remembering things. However, when you move up and you become a junior and senior, you have to run up that pyramid. So if you haven't done steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, your senior year is going to be incredibly difficult. So when you see the numbers that 75% of students do not graduate from a 4-year university, you can see why. The worse prepared you are, the less likely you're going to be able to finish. So we work very hard in the criminal justice department, especially, and it's not even a department, right? In the history, philosophy, political science department, of which we have something called criminal justice as a program, although all of you get an associate's degree in liberal arts, and then you have to major in something when you get to your transfer institution, or you go to the police academy where you can get 60 credits of anything, underwater basket weaving, looking at the wall, whatever you want to get your credits in. You don't need to be taking American legal system for sure, or constitutional law. And so I think when you get to this level, 66 and 67, the presumption is that you will be able to apply and analyze the information that you got in POL 51, Soc 31, and POL 63. You take sociology, Intro to American Government, and Intro to Criminal Justice, and you have the basics now. And so those classes, it's perfectly fine. I don't think it's great, and I think students learn more and they retain more, and this is proved out by multiple studies by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, that you'll do better in college if you can engage with critical thinking. But in those first 3 classes, you don't have to, and let's be honest, in most of those teachers are not requiring you to. But by the time you get to your upper level classes, and especially by the time you get to Dr. Chapman's policing class or minorities in criminal justice, you're going to be applying that information. And so we provide opportunities to remind you of the things that you were supposed to learn earlier on, and sometimes we go to extraordinary lengths to teach you things that you clearly didn't learn. But it's our job to make sure that you're able to apply the information before you get to John Jay, because then you're going to be analyzing, and then evaluating. And then, among the honor students among you, you'll be asked to create new knowledge. I'd like to push the creation of new knowledge down, along with Beverly Tatum, Bell Hooks. There's a number of researchers that would like to do this, and many of them are at Kingsborough. So, you want to think about this question I'd ask, okay, college is clearly a place for thinking, but that doesn't mean that all people who are at the college want to think. But my responsibility, as I understand it, is to encourage you to think whether you want to or not. And maybe this comes from my sports background, is that, the coach's obligation is to encourage the team to do the best it can, even on the days it doesn't feel very good. And that's the idea. That's kind of the idea. Now, when I think about this idea of applying the class content to myself, and I'm sitting here with the book that I did not write. Let's be clear about this. This is a collection of works that other people wrote, and if you had to buy each of these independently, it would cost about $500. What we've done, Helen and I, have edited it so that you're not reading the whole thing. Clash of Civilizations is a very long book, for example, and you're reading one excerpt from it. And we have to pay the authors of these books in order to publish it here, and that's what you're paying for. You're not paying me; you're paying them. Well, I plan to write books in the future. They won't be textbooks for class, right? This is something that came out of 6-7 years of students asking, how do we get content that's not like the textbook? Well, this is how. Because I can't understand why on earth anyone would pay $150 for information that you can find on YouTube. These things you have to pay for. And so we wanted to make sure you got access to that. So I was thinking, how can we kind of, practice what we preach? And so, the identity here is how I see myself, but it's also how I'm seen or how I'm labeled. So, clearly I am a professor at Kingsborough, but my research is in law and society. I am given law classes. The students who do the best in my classes tend to be those who are pre-law. I'm going to have a conversation with a student about going to law school in the future. I've written tons of letters of recommendations for students who are going into law. Also, students who plan on majoring in law and society at John Jay. I find that most students are not properly advised. You're not sure what you're going to major in. I'm going to try to get that presentation done next week for those of you who are transferring so that you're ready to go, especially if you're going to go online. But I have tons and tons and tons, thousands of conversations with students each year about what they're going to do after they leave Kingsborough because things are unclear. So I'm not just a professor, right? I'm a mentor. I'm an advisor. I like to think I'm just Jason, right? So some of you actually treat me respectfully and I get to be myself. But then other people, they treat me as an extension or a projection of things they don't like about the world. And I have to deal with that as well, just as you do. And so this is kind of the double bind or the two sides of our existence, right? What I see as what I want to be, and then what other people see me. Agency is the ability to see what the rules are and then apply those rules to kind of keep that balance, right? So if somebody is abusing me or if they're labeling me incorrectly, I can use the law as a tool to defend myself, okay? And that's kind of like a basic principle that I think you should know. And that's how we become subject of change, is by using the law, using rights as a tool. Then there's this bigger concept, and this is a harder one to get through, but I think that Justice Sotomayor, a justice on the Supreme Court, for some people who think that somehow this class isn't about the Supreme Court, there's multiple examples of Supreme Court legal reasoning in this reader. But one that I think is excellent is Sotomayor, who explains to you very clearly that advocacy is like something more, right? It's not enough to just know that there's a law out there. You say, oh, I have a First Amendment right. Great, but the First Amendment is not like a little robot that's going to come and defend you when somebody says that you're not allowed to say something. You have to have knowledge not only of your amendment rights, but you also have to know how you're going to activate those rights. And so this is all this concept of empowerment, rights, and justice. So you can believe in justice, but you can't activate justice. You can't actually see justice through unless you advocate for yourself. Now, advocating for yourself is probably going to mean advocating for others because there's power in groups. And so this is what Sotomayor is talking about, is that some people have to work harder. And so kind of go back to that first question, is college for thinking? Well, is law for thinking? Are rights for thinking? Is society for thinking? Clearly, if you think and you work together in a group, you're going to do better in life. And this is kind of common sense, as people would say, but as I talked to a student yesterday, we agreed that common sense is becoming less common. So we want to now think about this in the concept of power relations. Law is a social construct. It's things that we have created. We did not go into a mountain and pull out law. We don't go to Amazon.com and order law. This is something that we create. And so it's like a spirit. It's like a ghost. It's only this thing that we believe in, and it means whatever we think it means. And we being, the majority of people. So if you're not sure about law, you're in the minority. And at the end of the day, what we're thinking about, and this is why law is probably better thought of as a guide, is that it's trying to figure out what we are trying to figure out, what is the right thing to do. So, I just wanted to kind of put this out here, is like, I'm going to be walking through this presentation, applying these principles, and we want to think deeply. Okay, we want to think beyond law is obeyed, because you're going to see it's not going to work out for most of you if you simply see it that way. So I want to kind of put up two very confusing things from the beginning, and I might preface this by saying, in a good English literature class or American literature class, you will study something called modernism. And in modernism, you'll have writers who referred to all this, Latin, Greek, French, and they wouldn't put a footnote telling you what it meant. If you didn't understand it, they thought, you shouldn't be reading this. This isn't for you. And the idea was that, if you're thinking about progress, if you're trying to, believe in social mobility and you're trying to improve yourself, then you will go find out what these things mean. The problem is that in, newer science, what we see is that, you can't just go around collecting little bits of knowledge. You have to be able to take these big concepts and put them together. And that's something that requires conversation and dialogue with other people. So I'm going to leave this for now just to kind of put it out there. Is like, if you don't know what this means, those of you who look it up are probably doing a better job of thinking than those of you who are just, not sure. Now, the reason why this exists is because of rules. And what we mean by rules, and I immediately thought of this picture from when I worked in an elementary school. We're talking about kindergartners, and I've been tutoring my niece, 6-year-old niece, almost every day. And it's interesting because kids, in my experience, and those of you who have kids, you'll think about this, is that kids have like this understanding of rules. They see that there are rules, and they love talking about things that aren't fair. They're very quick to kind of correct situations that they don't like. But what they're really bad about is talking about what they think about the rules, how they feel about the rules, how to talk about what the rules should be. And so we want to think about this, and human beings kind of start into this habit very young. So if you learned that rules are co-constructed with your friends, and you think about a game of tag here, you're going to be better at this when you get older. If you were taught that you have to follow the rules or you get hit, then that's how you're going to treat people when you think about the rules. And so this is important to remember, that rules are learned. And so if you learn a law is a certain way, then that's how you're going to behave. And you're going to have to unlearn that behavior by thinking about it and having a dialogue with other people. So that's one thing that good teachers do with kindergartners, is that we sit down and we talk with kids and we help them practice this idea of sharing rules. So the big question becomes, like in a rule of law or in a country of laws, what if a person decides they don't want to follow the rules? And this is the hard thing. You can ask any teacher in a kindergarten or elementary school that this is like what they deal with on a regular basis. And for those of you who are having to teach your kids at home, you're seeing this. What if, on Tuesday or Thursday, they just decide, hey, I don't want to do anything. So how are you going to enforce the rules in a way that they understand that this is a system of rules? And they're clearly ignorant of that idea of rules of rules. So I want to use the example of libel because it's such an interesting example, because it's both criminal, you can go to jail for it, but I can also sue you if you defame me. And so I just pulled out the simple definition from Legal Information Institute. And this is the idea here, is that you'll see the legal definition of libel is different than Webster's dictionary definition. And so there's a legal standard here that has to be made. And the point being here is, you can see it can be done in any way. And I think effigies is my favorite version, but not many people put together effigies. But in online allegedly anonymous forums, you can be guilty of libel, and I can sue you, and you can go to jail. And so I think this is the idea, is that if the person is intending to injure the person's reputation, which will become clear, or they expose them to some kind of public dislike or hatred, then they're guilty. And it's for those of you who said law isn't obeyed, that you have to command you have to obey, or there's going to be consequences. I want you to think about this, because people are quite libelous online, especially in places like Rate My Professor, which I'm about to go to, and Facebook. So, I've got four, and this is, personal, so, but it's just business. I've got 4 comments by obviously the same person, in this last month, and they're obviously very upset, and, we can get into all the problems that this person might have, some other time. But the question just becomes, my rights have been violated, so should I sue? And this is like the big question. And in my courts class, what we've been thinking about is, if there's a harm, then there's a legal right that attaches to it. So if my reputation has been harmed, or the intent was that my reputation be harmed, the question then, should I sue? Should I take advantage of my rights? Should I be an agent? Or should I let this thing happen to me? Now, if I didn't know that I could sue, clearly I wouldn't sue. But my knowledge of the law, my power, gives me this ability to think about, what are my rights and should I activate them? So let's look at the guilt. These are the actual text of the comments, and you can kind of look at them there, and you can make up your own mind. Is this person guilty of intentionally trying to defame me? The standard here, now, if all these things were true, I probably would not, care, honestly. But because there's so many mistakes in the statement, in other words, they're not grounded in fact, and the person is clearly making mistakes just within their own logic, I have to believe that this is malicious, that this is intending to cause confusion, intending to cause some kind of defamation, to make me look worse than I am. And it's obvious that this person hasn't done any of the work. And so that's, this kind of back and forth here. On the one hand, they're ignorant. On the other hand, they are breaking the law. So how do we play this game? So we think about, the standard in law is the totality of the circumstances. And if you've taken Dr. Chapman, you've heard this phrase before. So, I could be as mad as a March hare, and I could, be suing the dormouse, the drunken dormouse, who's ignorant of the law and doesn't know the rules. But I have to put things in context, right? The totality of the circumstances. If I'm a judge and I look at my profile, I would say, well, are these comments likely to cause the rating to go down or people to be confused? If people scrolled through, then they'll see, the overwhelming majority of the comments are positive and, contradict what this other person said. On the other hand, right, if I was the lawyer, so now I'm the judge, the plaintiff, and the lawyer, I would say yes, but those comments came in rapid succession, so it's unlikely, based on data that I have from my own website and from YouTube, that people will scroll all the way down, right? That they'll look at the first 3 or 4 and they'll decide that they've made a judgment about me based on this person's defaming comments. So, this is where we'd want a jury. I'd want a jury to decide. I want people to say, what do you think? Do you think that this is libel? Do you think this was malicious defamation? Or is it unlikely to make a difference? Now, if I decided to go forward with the case, the first thing I would want to do is contact ratemyprofessors.com and, inform them. I'd give them what's called a cease and desist letter. And this person's account would be taken away from them, and they would be put on a red flag. Basically, I would have their IP address if I went forward with the lawsuit, so their anonymity would be gone. By the way, we would also look at what else are they doing on the internet on their IP address. Very likely this person used a cell phone, so we'd have all sorts of data that we could draw from. But I think the idea is that people think that they're anonymous, and your IP address goes with you everywhere you go, and at any time we can access that information. In fact, it became clear by Eric Snowden, that the United States government monitors your IP address on a regular basis. So I think this is kind of the first thing. Just first step is find out who is this person. The second thing is, I'd file a complaint in New York Supreme Court, and I'd find the address of the alleged defendant, and that would be served. And so this person now would have to deal with a lawsuit. I'd also consider, based on the lawsuit, talking to detectives to find out whether it might be worth bringing a criminal action against this person, because they might have done this to other people. And so that would have a weight on the public good. Now, I would also want to calculate my damages. So I'd want a minimum of $5,000 here in a lawsuit. And I would start to think about this way. In what ways is this harming my reputation as far as future economic wages, promotions? I mean, all these different things. And the problem that I think most people would have is like, well, how do you decide these things? Well, there's something in tort law called the eggshell skull rule. And it's Vosburg is the case. And this kid kicked this other kid in school, and what he didn't know is that he had a rare bone calcium deficiency, and he broke his bones. And so, that kick wouldn't have been a big deal. Kids kick each other all the time. But for this particular plaintiff, you have to take them as they are. So in this lawsuit, all of this information about me would come out that shows that I might be more vulnerable to this kind of attack, and that could then include pain and suffering, which would then go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the student would owe me. Then, this would be reported to CUNY, and the student would be removed from Kingsborough, and they would not be permitted to go to any other city university institution. And then also this would go on their record, and it would come up in a variety of background checks. They'd have a hard time getting a job. And so you can see the idea of protecting people from libel is fierce. And you'll see this as the more you kind of pay attention to powerful people, they use this lawsuit regularly, and people at Kingsborough have used this before, just to throw that out there. Now, the main thing I've been trying to teach you in the legal system class, and then to some extent in the constitutional law class, you should have picked this up. And so if you haven't picked this up by now, then you've done it. It wasn't a necessary learning outcome, but the idea is you would have taken 66 and then you take 67. So in 66 you'd learn the framework for the game of law, and then when you take 67 you learn the language of law to play in that game. But here's how you'd play in that game now that we've set up the framework for law. Is you say something, I would say something like this in my complaint. I'd say, like the rule laid out by the United States Supreme Court, this person has acted with actual malice, that is, with knowledge that was false or with reckless disregard. I think that's what they did here, of whether it was false or not. So they put out outlandish statements that they had no way of verifying. Now, this is the standard according to the United States Supreme Court, and that's why it's quoted, and I give the citation. And this is what sets up my legal claim. I'm now able to bring my claim in court, and now this person is going to have to defend themselves and hire a lawyer or represent themselves, I suppose. And now that's going to cost them, thousands of dollars. Now, professors, I've just a very brief research on this. Professors have sued in Wisconsin, California, Washington states for damage of reputation by student comments on this particular website, ratemyprofessor.com. This is great news for me. It also means that I'm very likely to get one of my friends to represent me, and they will take a third of the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we'll win, either in settling or in an actual lawsuit decision going my way. Because there's been success in other places. And so this makes my success more likely. Probably most pertinent, though, or the most important part I would put in my complaint is that the student violated the actual guidelines posted on the website, in that they did not limit their comment to one post, they did not honestly assess a particular skill set, and it is not based in fact. So in other words, they were probably one of those human beings that just clicked I agree to the terms and conditions of the website without reading it, but boom, gotcha, you violated the contract. And so you're already guilty before you even, before I even really sued you. And so now at this point, I can just use that as, my evidence that, well, they didn't follow the guidelines. And so they clearly were in reckless disregard. So you go back to that legal case there. And so that's what abduction is I'm not deducting anything. I'm not inducting. I'm abducting. I'm saying, like the rule here, like this situation here, this individual has violated the rule. And then finally, thus under the existing rule of law, no one is exempt from spreading malicious and harmful gossip, including this person, under a supposed anonymous posting. So the idea that they're going to try to throw out the defense, well, I didn't know, right? I was ignorant that they would ever know that it was me who did this, and that's why I posted it. In other words, they're saying they wouldn't have done it if their name was there. In other words, they wouldn't say it to my face. Which has its own, moral and ethical problems. And I think, this is where it comes down. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And that is the Latin phrase that I gave you at the beginning of the presentation. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And professors are entitled to an injunction, meaning that needs to be taken down, monetary damage, meaning I can sue them, and I could pursue criminal charges against the libel conduct by students. So be careful what you post is what we learned in law school. Be very careful about what you say online and what you put on your emails. Now, we're not done, right? The KCC rules have been violated as well. So if you read your student handbook, the Henderson rules, and I also have academic freedom under the First Amendment, this is kind of, like icing on the cake or the nail that, in the coffin. There's multiple violations here that would basically bury the student. So that brings me now to this big kind of difficulty. If we're a team here in Kingsborough, then my goal is for everyone to know the rules. So the right thing to do would clearly for the student to go and remove those comments. That would be the right thing. For those of you who have never done anything like this, the right thing to do would not to do this. Don't defame people. Don't, commit libel, the criminal offense of libel. Don't gossip, if I could go so far as to be moral. But this is the trouble, right, in collective action theory, is that 9 out of 10 people are going to do the right thing. And they do it out of their selfish interest, but they also do it because they're called conditional cooperators. So most people are going to work towards some kind of progress. The big question becomes what do you do with the one person who is the problem? Because they can spoil the whole group, right? And any of you who've done group work, you know this, right? Most people are trying to do their best. Each person has different skill sets, but there's always the one person who wants to cause trouble. So what do you do with them under a rule of law? It's not going to be enough simply to put them in jail, right? Because they're going to do the same thing there. They're going to then come out and they're going to continue to do the same thing. So we have to try to think about, is there some structural arrangement? Is there some way, short of just banishing them, right? Deporting them, exiling them, terminating their life. Is there something that we could do? Is there some way? Well, the theory in science, and remember this is a political science class, is that we have to have some kind of a translation table. We need to understand the language of this human being. So they're clearly upset. Let's go back to that basic idea. They're upset. And what they're upset with is that this class, this law class, is not like their intro to criminal justice class. It's not like their some other class. I think it's a high compliment that they, compared me to an English class in the sense that I guess they had to do reading in my class. But you see that, they got used to this set of rules of just taking a multiple choice exam. Now, which is insane in this distance learning, from my opinion, right? Because you aren't learning anything. You're looking at the book, you're looking at the computer screen, and you're picking the right answer. I mean, you can't even do that on the lottery. So it's not even a helpful skill in pushing, the right buttons on your gambling toy. So you have to think about what is it that this student is learning? And this is a big problem, not just for Kingsborough, for this kind of learning environment, because they're going to resist any kind of thinking in any kind of class. And we all know who those students are. But they're going to behave this way in society as well. So they're going to be the person in the line that doesn't think that they need to wear a mask in the pandemic. They're going to be the person who thinks that they should get special treatment at the restaurant. They're always going to do this. So this is kind of this problem of rule violators that we have to try to solve. And the idea is that you solve it through the law. That's at least why you're taking these legal classes. Now, so we go back to this kind of conversation. So is ignorance an excuse? No. And Thomas Jefferson famously said, you can't have ignorance be an excuse, because then that would be an incentive for people to not learn what the rules are. So this is kind of the trick, right? There's so many rules, and I assume that this student didn't learn the crime of libel in Intro to Criminal Justice or in their crime and punishment class. Interesting, right? Wow, did they not learn these crimes? But, it's reasonable to think that, okay, it's difficult to learn all these things. So if everyone doesn't know the law, what should they do? Well, this cartoon that was in the book kind of shows you nothing. And that's the big problem here, right? The last thing I would want this student to do is to do nothing. What I'd like for them to do is learn more about the law, to even maybe try to defend themselves, using the law, using rights mentality, or to analyze their own behavior and say, maybe I shouldn't have done this because it's not right. And that's what we kind of want. This is what we mean by critical thinking, and this is what we really hope you do in a classroom, that you learn about the content and then you apply it back to your own life in order to kind of improve your behavior, because you have to think about something. When Thomas Jefferson wrote this, it was in the time of self-government. So the people who knew the law participated in making the law, in enforcing the law. It was a jury of your peers. This is largely not the case. And you can take sociology classes. By the way, criminal justice is a part of sociology. You can take sociology classes that will better educate you about why this doesn't happen today, why there's a tiny minority of powerful people, often called white males, that are setting all the rules. Well, it goes back to the haves and the have-nots. It's because white males are largely educated about the rules, so they participate, or I should say we participate more in the making of the rules. We feel more confident in using the rules. If you have not experienced that and you're in a social group that has not taught you that, then, it's going to be much more likely that you're the folks on the bottom here that, I don't want change because I don't know how to make it. So one reason you go to school to think is to learn about how you can make change and how you can apply the rules in a way that benefits you and furthers your goals. And so, of course, ignorance is an excuse. And of course, you're in college so that you're no longer ignorant, right? This is the kind of whole point of learning and thinking. So I want to end with this kind of interesting dilemma then, as you kind of continue on. And I hope that you kind of continue to think about these things as you move through the world. I've given you what is a perfect example of the constituted positionality of law. If you don't quite understand what that is, it's okay, right? I've been doing this a long time, and you need to read a lot of books in order to kind of have a better understanding, and you need to get more life experience practicing and thinking about rights consciousness. But if I could briefly explain is that, given my identity, I can be an agent of change because I know the law. I know the rules of the game. It's easier for me to pull them up when there's been a harm against me. And so the more you kind of get into that practice and you see law as a tool of resistance and a construct, the easier this will be. If you're simply looking at law as a command, then you always have to ask yourself a question: who is giving the command? And if it's not somebody who has your best interest, I cannot understand why on earth you would follow that command. So that gets us to this. Clearly, the answer is that no, power relations are not fair. And so if the rule of law is supposed to be fair and it's supposed to, avoid chaos, it's wishful thinking that you think that there's no chaos. I mean, chaos is the absence of predictability and stability. If you don't know the law, then you're just ignorance is bliss. You don't realize you're in chaos. And so, of course, you would see something like a law enforcement officer, a police officer, somebody who upholds stability and predictability, but they don't. They participate in the chaos just like everybody else. So then the question becomes, in this particular instance, right? Should every single act of injustice be met with an equal act of justice? Should I sue the student and use their own weakness against them? Personally, no, I don't think, I'm not going to. I have other things that I'd like to do. Instead, I've made this so that students don't make the same mistake as they move forward because, it reminds me of file sharing. In the early 2000s, folks would say, well, if this is against the law, why is it so easy? Or they'd say, yeah, but they're never going to know it's me. Well, there's, kids that went to jail, people who've had to pay a lot of money and gone bankrupt and have negative credit, reporting, who thought those things. And again, they were ignorant. They didn't know the law. Joseph Biden actually was one of the people who was one of the most vicious in coming after young people for violating copyright and for file sharing. It goes on today. So, at any moment, people can get in trouble for that. And they all say the same thing. Why is it so easy? And how did anyone know who I was? As if somehow because you're using a cell phone, you think that nobody knows you're using it. That's insane. And so I think, people are just walking around. They want to enforce their rights, but they don't really understand their responsibilities under the law. So what does this say about civic engagement and citizenship, which is one of the things that you're supposed to be thinking about, and it's a graduation requirement, and I have to assess it by law. And so, I want you to think about this. If somebody can always get away with breaking the rules, and this person is largely probably going to get away with it, let's be honest. Now, will there be some kind of karmic experience or, in the famous words of Johnny Cash, will they be cut down by God? Who knows, right? But this is the big problem of civic engagement and citizenship is that if there are no consequences, which there are largely not consequences for people who break the rules, then what does that say about the rules? And if the rules are unfairly applied and they benefit people who know the rules better, then what does that say about people's ability to move throughout society and improve their own life? And so this kind of gets into big conversations that we have because there are no easy answers. So then I want to think about like what other remedies do I have? And here I want to kind of point out the Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, Steve Kerr. I'm curious to watch this documentary now because of all the news media and apparently teammates who are quite unhappy with Michael Jordan for apparently defaming them, right? And so should they sue him is the big question here. Or are there other remedies? So for example, yes, right? They can make a YouTube. They can talk to people. They can educate people. They can go on TV and tell people, the truth about the situation. In other words, the lawsuit or legal rights are not the only way of defending yourself. And so you want to think about that. But then on the other hand, why not enforce my legal rights? It's my right. I have the right to do it. I'd probably be protecting other professors in the future against libel conduct. Why not do it? So I think this is always the balance. It's like, is it worth my time? I worked on a case one time where a doctor had negligently killed a man who went in, who was suffering a heart attack. And the doctor said he thought it was indigestion. He didn't do any of the proper tests. He sent the man home. The man then died 2 hours later. The doctor apologized to the family, felt terrible. And then the wife, decided not to sue. She didn't think that, she thought he had suffered enough in his guilt. Well, that's interesting, right? The person decided not to act on their rights. And my worry is that if you look up the medical malpractice rates, is that the same doctors tend to be the ones who make these mistakes over and over again. And so if you don't sue, then they're likely to do it to somebody else. And so what does that say about social relations and law being kind of a stable and predictable thing? So that, these are the things we have to think about. But I want to end with this problem, though, is that you look at the responses to the first question on the midterm, and there's only 56 people out of 110 actually answered it. That means I have evidence that the school gets knowledge of that half of the students could not evidence understanding of the learning outcome in the POL 66 class, and so when you see that 75% of students do not graduate from Kingsborough, it's because they're not doing the work. And there's all sorts of reasons why this happens. And we go back to equity. But this is the hard part, is that unless we can change the social conditions, we can't expect that miracles are going to happen in an individual classroom. And then even of the students who answered the question, almost half of them got it wrong. And so this is, you all had the same reading. This is a major, what's called a landmark case that you'll hear about again in the future in your classes. And so if students aren't able to read and understand, then that was the second level on Bloom's taxonomy. So we have a real big challenge here at Kingsborough, is that if students aren't getting the training before they come to college about how to do what's called reading comprehension, and this is a big issue that Kingsborough is trying to address, is that most students don't have the level of reading comprehension that they need to have before they get there. Same thing with math and science. And so these students aren't being able to finish. So those of you who have the reading comprehension skills, who have the math and science skills, you might feel great, and you should feel great, right? But these are your peers, and these are the citizens that you're going to live with, and this is the hard part. One student recently said she wasn't sure whether Kingsborough students should have the power to participate in politics. We had a long discussion about it, but it's a common observation that if folks can't read and write about their basic legal obligations, should they be entrusted to rights? Should they benefit from that? And this was the argument made in Scott versus Sanford. So using legal reasoning of abduction, as rights are being taken away, as voting rights are being taken away, as your freedoms are being taken away, I am not optimistic if people don't have this basic reading comprehension and can quickly learn how to activate their rights. So that's one of the reasons why I was asked to teach this particular way at Kingsborough Community College. And I'm in constant conversation with professors at John Jay, and many of us are thinking about what more can we do, right? And especially in this now distance learning environment, what more can we do to close these equity gaps? I think the honest answer has to be we have to deal with the problems as they come. We can't be like the cartoon, and here I'm talking about professors and administrators. We can't be like the cartoon where we just ignore it and say, well, I don't want to change. And so I would encourage the student to actually do the right thing and email me, and let's talk about how we can actually improve your learning. And I think this is a lesson that I want to have to all of you as you move forward, is that in these times and in this instant gratification psychological therapy model where everybody thinks that they're entitled to something, it's easy to lash out and to lose your cool and to do the wrong thing. And you might even get away with it. But in the college environment, try to remember that we're all human beings. We're all doing the best we can. And so if you disagree with something, and this is something I'm working on my 6-year-old niece with, it's kind of basic. I remember in kindergarten, it's what's your name? Important here, right? What's your name? Don't hide behind anonymous posts. And 2, name your feelings. Like, how do you feel? Are you frustrated by this experience? Are you disappointed? Are you upset because you're not learning? Be responsible for your own feelings. And then 3rd, propose a solution. I mean, it's so easy to criticize something, right? But if you don't have an answer about how to improve your own learning, what can I do? You have to meet me halfway. And so try to remember this as you go forward, and try to participate in the construction of the rules with your professor and learn the rules. Read the student handbook, especially when you transfer to John Jay. Read, or wherever you're going, right? Read the rules of the game. Try to learn as quickly as possible who has the right to do what. I have the academic freedom to teach however I want. Now, if you don't like that, become a lawyer, attack the First Amendment, and get it changed. Become a politician and change the congressional laws. But these are society, right? The society has agreed that professors should be given the ability to teach the way they see fit. And, to close, I'm not going to sue because it's not going to affect me. It could, right? I don't know for sure. But I'll be confident enough to say that I think that most human beings can look at the website. They can look at the materials I'm providing. They can go to YouTube and judge for themselves. I don't hide. Many professors don't share their work. I always analyze student data, and I improve the practice based on the students I have, not on broad generalizations about what I think students are. I've talked with hundreds of students over the last 6 months, one-on-one. We've had lots of conversations. My suspicion is I've talked to this student as well. And so I think the issue here becomes, how can we create a situation in which higher education teaches people about their rights, but also teaches them about the responsibilities of being in a social relation, right, with other human beings, in a way that furthers civic engagement and that helps us learn more about equity, right? I wish I could know more about what students are struggling with. I get as much information as I can. And most of those assignments that you do, like I said, probably a dozen times, you get credit for that. You get extra, I don't use points in the same way as a multiple choice test, but you get extra, grading. And by and large, most students do very well in my classes. And so the reason is because we're in a constant dialogue, and that's the real key of law. Hopefully at some point you'll start to get into the Greek and Roman basis of law, and you'll learn about what's called nomos, and that's the negotiation of this vision of law. And that's why, we've been saying law as a tool just to kind of get you away from the ideas law as an object. But it's really a symbol. It's a conception. And it might be better thought of as a spirit. It's something that kind of binds us and loosens us based on what we believe in it. And so we have to have a shared language about it. So when you do your final exam, I think you need to see how different people are in different situations, and so the law can't be one thing. And if you say that, if you understand that, Scottie Pippen has rights in a way that Michael Jordan is abusing them, and I like Michael Jordan, but I also like Scottie Pippen a lot, and I think, we want to think about how can we have equity or fairness when people have different status, right? When they have different role power. And that's the big thing that you should be thinking about. So I hope this was helpful. I wanted to kind of have a joyful spirit about this, even though I think it's annoying. And I think everybody agrees, right? When your rights are violated, it's frustrating and you wish that people would do the right thing. But the key here is that, right, we'd be naive to think that, and we don't want to be ignorant. We want to learn the law. We want to learn more about the law. And we want to use the law in a way that kind of promotes what's called justice, right? Social justice. And that's one of the key principles if you go to the John Jay website. Because maybe many of you don't know that if you're enrolled in the Justice Academy or what's called the Criminal Justice Program, even it's called the Justice Academy, you're actually students at John Jay. And so we're preparing you to be third and fourth year students so that you can join your colleagues there and know the same thing that they know. So I hope you all have tried to do, the best you can and have somewhat enjoyed this experience. I know it's frustrating, but I think that from looking at most of the student work and a lot of the conversations I've had, were just wonderful conversations with students. Many of you have just made tremendous progress during this time, and I think that's admirable, and you should, as my niece says, give yourself a high five because you rose to the occasion and you overcame a very difficult situation. And again, for the most part, most of you have done this. So I'm certainly proud of Kingsborough students, and I'm happy to be doing this work.